So the idea of this presentation is to introduce the notion of research-based teaching, including different ways of thinking about it, and to briefly share experience of my research-based teaching module, Imagining European Futures. There is a number of challenges in undergraduate teaching that we increasingly kind of recognized. For example, if most of the topics covered in the lectures can be easily found on the internet, delivered by world-class experts, what is the incentive for students to attend lectures and stay engaged? If a lot of academic writing appears disconnected from what students perceive as real-world problems, how to convince them to do the reading and prepare for seminar discussions other than through imposing penalties? This changing reality is increasingly recognized in strategies and plans for the transformation of higher education in Europe, not just the UK. The UK's Higher Education Academy prompts all higher education institutions to incorporate research-based study for undergraduates, to cultivate awareness of research careers, to train students in research skills for employment, and to sustain the advantages of a research-teaching connection. So what are the potential benefits of research-based teaching? Well, that depends on what we actually mean by this concept. One way to think about research-based teaching is to say that all it means is a lecturer sharing his or her research with students. Lecturers are often active researchers, and they may find ways to incorporate their own research interests into the lectures. They may also ask students to read their publications. That's what we often do. This is a rather limited understanding of research-based teaching, as it continues to position students as relatively passive recipients of knowledge. Another more ambitious understanding of research-based teaching positions students as at the center as active researchers. This understanding resembles what our colleague Russell Bentley explains to our prospective students during university open and visit days. What Russell says is that for us, research-based teaching entails that we are all researchers, both staff and students. The only difference is that we are at different stages, and some of us are more advanced than others. I think this is right, and I believe we should try and be creative about allowing students to experience the actual research beyond their dissertation projects. So if we think about research-based teaching in this broader way, what are its key benefits? Well, it focuses on students as learners. The research-based approach is student-centered, and students have a relatively larger degree of autonomy over their learning. It explicitly brings the student into the world of research. Students are not mere consumers of research conducted by academic staff, but they engage in real-life research themselves. Research-based teaching encourages viewing the student as a potential producer of knowledge. Students are encouraged to think of the assessment tasks as research outputs and are actively involved in dissemination. It values all academic and support staff. Library support staff can be involved in providing training for students, and other staff members can be invited to participate in dissemination activities. And finally, it breaks down institutional firewalls between teaching and research. Students' research activities can be advertised and promoted among staff and vice versa. In spite of those benefits, implementing research-based teaching remains a challenge for higher education institutions, as the established understandings of what teaching and research involve are hard to overcome. There are often good reasons for it. Academic staff is often overworked and overwhelmed with routine tasks, preventing them from investing necessary time and undertaking risk to experiment with novel pedagogical approaches. This is understandable, and I have no ready solution to that challenge. What I want to do instead is to briefly share my own experience of running a research-based module called Imagining European Futures. This is a new module which I ran this year for the first time. It is an optional module for second and third year students. The module introduces students to the key dilemmas of European integration, followed by the thorough training in creative yet analytically sound research inquiry and discovery. The idea of the module is to offer students the opportunity to engage with the most important and interesting questions of European integration in the context of the learning structure replicating real-world research activities. such as peer review and presenting at conferences. The primary objective of this module is to allow students of different disciplines engage with the key challenges facing the EU and the European integration process, and to develop bold ideas for reimagining European integration to make Europe more secure, more prosperous, more inclusive, and a welcome place to live for future generations. In this module, instead of lectures, student learning is organized around guided research sessions, which contain elements of lectures, seminars, and online learning. Instead of being a lecturer, the module leader performs the role of a research mentor. The teaching and learning activities for this module are organized as to give students experience of undergraduate research and inquiry with the appropriate level of independence. The teaching and learning activities for Imagining European Futures consist of 3 elements. So they include guided research sessions, 2 hours per week, which constitute the core of the teaching and learning activities for the module. They are de facto blended learning sessions during which students learn through a combination of introductory lectures and practical exercises, including a broad use of online resources. Then there is going to be the Undergraduate Jean Monnet Conference in the final week of teaching, which will replicate the format of academic conferences in order to complete the student experience of learning through research. In the meantime, there is also online dissemination preparation sessions, at least 2 hours a week, through Microsoft Teams. So every research project must include dissemination activities. In this module, students are guided to replicate the standard model of academic research dissemination, including peer review of draft papers, the production of conference papers, and a conference presentation. Using Microsoft Teams as a collaboration tool, students are guided through the process of turning their research findings into research outputs intended to captivate non-expert audience. The final thing I want to do is to kind of outline the structure of the module week by week so that you can get a better idea of what students do in different weeks. So week 1 is the introduction. In week 2, I introduced the challenges to European integration. Students can get the idea of what the actual challenges to European integration are. I also asked them which ones they thought were most important or most interesting to look at. In week 3, we practiced doing literature review. So we did it in a way that I essentially distributed examples of 3 literature reviews, and we analyzed the strengths, the weaknesses. I asked them to consider, what they thought about the quality of those literature reviews and how they can adopt best practice for their own papers. Then in week 4, we had a literature review workshop. This was a peer review session. It was the first peer review session that I ever did. In essence, students read each other's work and gave comments. So I first explained the idea of peer review, what's involved, how it should be done, and they did it. They commented on each other's work. I was also walking around giving my own feedback. In week 5, we worked on constructing interesting research questions. So I kind of introduced students to this idea that you can either contribute to the literature, you can search for the gaps, you can search for areas, problems that are under-researched, and you can kind of fill this gap with your research. That's the kind of standard approach. But I also introduced them to this idea of challenging the assumptions underpinning certain body of scholarship. So problematizing the literature. That was the other thing that we did. In week 6, we talked about developing an argument. So again, we looked at examples of arguments. So these are not lectures, right? What we did there each week was looking at specific examples and work with examples. So in week 6, students looked at abstracts of actual papers and they had to identify arguments. What are the arguments there? Are they clearly developed? In week 7, we talked about theorizing the EU and European integration. Students learned why it is important to think a little bit more theoretically about different aspects of European integration. In week 8, we looked at critical analytical writing. Students practiced what it means to write critically, to write analytically, they practiced it in relation to their own papers that they kind of work on. In week 9, so that's next week, we will actually be recording videos. So I invite students to record short videos explaining the research that they do, and then I can compile it into a larger kind of video clip. So it's about disseminating research kind of findings in non-standard formats. In week 10, we will have another peer review session. So the first peer review session was for the first assignment I did, which was literature review. And in week 10, we'll have another peer review session, and that's for the second assignment, or research output, as I kind of call them in that module. And this will be a research paper. So they will read drafts of each other's research papers and give feedback. In week 11, we will talk about creating engaging conference presentations. How do you build an engaging, interesting conference presentation? And in week 12, we will actually have the undergraduate Jamonet conference, Imagining European Futures, where students will present their research papers in a kind of very short presentations, and it will be the final part of the assessment. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.